India is increasingly described as the next China because global manufacturing and capital flows are slowly reorienting away from Beijing. Rising labor costs, geopolitical tensions, and supply chain disruptions have pushed companies to search for an alternative scale economy, and India appears to fit the role. With a massive population, a young workforce, and a fast-growing domestic market, India offers something few countries can replicate: simultaneously scale and demand. Government initiatives promoting manufacturing infrastructure investment and digitalization have strengthened this perception. Multinationals now speak openly about China, plus one strategies where India features prominently. On paper, the parallels look convincing. China once combined low costs, political stability, export focus, and demographic momentum to transform itself into the world's factory. India today shows similar early-stage signals with expanding industrial zones, rising exports, and record foreign investment announcements. Yet the comparison often skips context. China's rise occurred under a highly centralized system capable of coordinating land-labor finance and logistics at extraordinary speed. India operates within a democratic framework with fragmented governance, slower execution, and diverse regional outcomes. These differences matter because scale manufacturing demands consistency, not just potential. India's advantage lies in services, technology, and consumption, while China built dominance through manufacturing discipline. This creates opportunity, but also risk. Becoming the next China does not mean copying China's path. It means absorbing global demand without overpromising delivery. India's growth narrative is powerful and partially justified, but it is still in formation. The transition from promise to performance determines whether the comparison holds. The world wants an alternative, but alternatives are not created by demand alone. They are built through execution patience and trade-offs that shape long-term competitiveness. India stands at the start of that test, not its conclusion. Momentum attracts attention, but only systems decide whether momentum. One of the strongest reasons India is compared to China is its demographic profile, which appears perfectly timed for global manufacturing realignment. India has one of the youngest populations in the world, with millions entering the workforce every year, while China's labor force is shrinking and aging rapidly. For labor-intensive industries, this shift matters. Wages in China have risen steadily, reducing its cost advantage, whereas India still offers relatively low labor costs, combined with improving skill levels. This demographic dividend creates the perception that India can absorb factories, supply chains, and investment at scale. However, demographics alone do not create productivity. A large workforce becomes an asset only when workers are healthy, educated, mobile, and employable within formal systems. China invested aggressively in basic education, technical training, and urban infrastructure before and during its manufacturing boom. India's progress has been uneven. While elite talent in technology and engineering is globally competitive, large portions of the workforce remain informal, underskilled, and disconnected from industrial ecosystems. Labor laws, complex compliance, and limited factory scale have historically constrained job creation in manufacturing. Reforms are underway, but implementation varies by state. Unlike China, India's labor market is not unified. Productivity differs sharply across regions, creating fragmented outcomes. This limits the speed at which national-scale manufacturing can emerge. Demographics also interact with urbanization. China moved hundreds of millions into industrial cities rapidly. India's urban transition is slower, constrained by housing infrastructure and local governance capacity. Without dense industrial clusters, labor advantages diffuse instead of compounding. This does not negate India's potential, but it delays payoff. Demographics create opportunity, windows not guarantees. If employment growth fails to match population growth, the dividend can turn into pressure. Social strain, unemployment, and underemployment weaken growth narratives quickly. India's challenge is converting numbers into output before expectations outrun reality. The comparison to China assumes this conversion is automatic. History suggests it is not. Execution determines whether demographics amplify growth or expose limits. One of the strongest reasons India is compared to China is its demographic profile, which appears perfectly timed for global manufacturing realignment. India has one of the youngest populations in the world, with millions entering the workforce every year, while China's labor force is shrinking and aging rapidly. For labor-intensive industries, this shift matters. Wages in China have risen steadily, reducing its cost advantage, whereas India still offers relatively low labor costs combined with improving skill levels. This demographic dividend creates the perception that India can absorb factories, supply chains, and investment at scale. However, demographics alone do not create productivity. A large workforce becomes an asset only when workers are healthy, educated, mobile, and employable within formal systems. China invested aggressively in basic education, technical training, and urban infrastructure before and during its manufacturing boom. India's progress has been uneven. While elite talent in technology and engineering is globally competitive, large portions of the workforce remain informal, underskilled, and disconnected from industrial ecosystems. Labor laws, complex compliance, and limited factory scale have historically constrained job creation in manufacturing. Reforms are underway, but implementation varies by state. Unlike China, India's labor market is not unified. Productivity differs sharply across regions, creating fragmented outcomes. This limits the speed at which national-scale manufacturing can emerge. Demographics also interact with urbanization. China moved hundreds of millions into industrial cities rapidly. India's urban transition is slower, constrained by housing infrastructure and local governance capacity. Without dense industrial clusters, labor advantages diffuse instead of compounding. This does not negate India's potential, but it delays payoff. Demographics create opportunity windows, not guarantees. If employment growth fails to match population growth, the dividend can turn into pressure. Social strain, unemployment, and underemployment weaken growth narratives quickly. India's challenge is converting numbers into output before expectations outrun reality. The comparison to China assumes this conversion is automatic. History suggests it is not. Execution determines whether demographics amplify growth or expose limits. A young population promises power, but only systems decide whether it delivers. Another major reason India is being positioned as the new China is the scale of infrastructure investment underway across the country. Highways, ports, rail corridors, airports, and digital networks have expanded rapidly over the past decade, reducing logistical friction that once made large-scale manufacturing uncompetitive. China's rise was inseparable from infrastructure that allowed factories to move goods cheaply and reliably across vast distances. India is now attempting a similar build-out with industrial corridors, special economic zones, and improved power availability. These developments matter because manufacturing competitiveness depends less on wages than on logistics reliability and speed. Delays raise costs quietly and consistently. India has made measurable progress by cutting transport times, improving port efficiency, and expanding digital payment and identity systems that reduce transaction friction. This has improved ease of doing business and attracted global firms seeking diversification. However, gaps remain. Infrastructure quality varies sharply between states, creating uneven industrial outcomes. Some regions operate close to global standards, while others lag significantly. Coordination across land acquisition, local approvals, and environmental clearance remains slow compared to China's centralized model. Power supply reliability, though improved, still poses challenges for energy-intensive industries. Infrastructure in India is advancing, but not uniformly. This creates islands of efficiency rather than a seamless national manufacturing platform. China's advantage was not just building infrastructure, but synchronizing it across regions with national planning. India's federal structure produces experimentation, but also inconsistency. That trade-off shapes outcomes. While progress is real, it is also fragile. Momentum must be sustained over decades, not political cycles. Infrastructure enables scale, but does not guarantee it. Without complementary reforms in land, labor, and finance, assets remain underutilized. India's build-out signals seriousness, but execution speed will determine whether it can host China-scale production or remain a partial substitute. The world is watching whether infrastructure momentum converts into manufacturing depth or stalls at visibility. Infrastructure creates the stage, but performance depends on everything that follows. Global geopolitics has become a powerful tailwind behind India's China comparison, accelerating interest that might otherwise have taken much longer to develop. Trade wars, sanctions, export controls, and strategic rivalry have made dependence on a single manufacturing hub politically risky for many countries and corporations. As firms look to diversify supply chains, India appears attractive because it offers scale without direct alignment against major blocs. Governments actively encourage this shift through incentives, trade agreements, and diplomatic signaling. India benefits from being positioned as a strategic partner rather than a geopolitical adversary. This context matters because China's rise occurred during an era of globalization that prioritized efficiency over security. India's opportunity emerges in a world that values resilience alongside cost. That difference creates demand that even before full readiness. However, geopolitical demand can create distorted expectations. Investment driven by risk avoidance rather than pure competitiveness may tolerate inefficiency temporarily but not indefinitely. Firms may enter India to hedge exposure, yet still retain China as the primary hub until performance proves comparable. This creates dual-track strategies rather than replacement. India must deliver reliability quickly to convert hedging into commitment. Geopolitical favor also fluctuates. Policy priorities shift with elections alliances and global conditions. A strategy built too heavily on external encouragement risks vulnerability if incentives fade. China's manufacturing dominance was reinforced by relentless internal optimization, not diplomatic support. India's test is whether geopolitics merely opens the door, or whether domestic systems can sustain momentum once attention moves elsewhere. There is also a risk of complacency. Political validation can reduce urgency for reform by masking structural bottlenecks. If expectations rise faster than execution, credibility erodes. The opportunity is real, but conditional. Geopolitics can accelerate adoption, but cannot substitute for competitiveness. India's success depends on whether it treats current interest as temporary leverage rather than permanent advantage. History shows that strategic windows close quickly when performance fails to match promise. External demand opens opportunities, but only internal capability decides who keeps them. Despite momentum, India faces structural risks that could prevent it from fully becoming the next China. Manufacturing at scale demands uniform rules, fast dispute resolution, and predictable compliance across regions. India's federal system creates variation in land acquisition, labor regulation, and taxation that complicates nationwide scale-up. Firms operating across states encounter differing approvals timelines and enforcement standards, increasing coordination costs. Labor laws have improved, but implementation remains uneven, and informality persists, limiting productivity gains. Factory sizes remain smaller on average than China's, reducing economies of scale and supplier density. Logistics improvements coexist with last-mile bottlenecks and urban congestion that add hidden delays. Energy reliability has improved, yet costs and distribution issues still challenge heavy industry in some regions. Another risk is skills mismatch. While top-tier engineering talent is abundant, vocational training at mass scale lags manufacturing needs. China invested heavily in technical institutes aligned with factories enabling rapid workforce absorption. India's training ecosystem is expanding, but remains fragmented. Financing is also a constraint. Long-term patient capital for manufacturing is scarcer than for services or real estate, raising costs and slowing expansion. Policy incentives help, but can create dependency rather than competitiveness if not time-bound. Finally, bureaucratic capacity matters. China's local governments acted as growth engines, coordinating permits, infrastructure, and finance. India's administrative capacity varies widely, producing uneven execution. None of these risks are fatal individually, but together they determine speed. The global window favors alternatives now, but patience is limited. If execution lags, expectations recalibrate quickly. India's challenge is to compress timelines without compromising democratic processes. Success requires relentless focus on consistency, scale, and skills across regions. Meeting these constraints requires coordinated reforms, sustained investment, and accountability measured consistently over time across institutions nationwide with urgency. Opportunity rewards execution and punishes delay without warning. Another critical factor that will determine whether India truly becomes the next China is how it handles industrial clustering and supply chain depth. China's manufacturing strength did not come from isolated factories, but from dense ecosystems, where suppliers, assemblers, logistics firms, and skilled labor operated in close proximity. These clusters reduced costs, accelerated learning, and allowed rapid scaling. India is attempting to build similar ecosystems through industrial parks and special manufacturing zones, but progress remains uneven. Many facilities still rely on imported components because domestic supplier networks are shallow. This limits value addition and slows responsiveness to global demand shifts. Building supply depth takes time, coordination, and trust between firms. It cannot be legislated instantly. China spent decades nurturing local suppliers through scale guarantees and long-term contracts. India's supplier base is improving but remains fragmented across regions and firm sizes. Small and medium enterprises often lack access to credit technology and predictable demand. Without integration, they struggle to upgrade. Large firms hesitate to rely on them, fully creating a loop that delays maturation. Logistics and customs efficiency have improved, but integration across suppliers remains inconsistent. Another challenge is standardization. Manufacturing ecosystems require consistent quality and process norms across hundreds of firms. India's diversity complicates this alignment. However, diversity also offers resilience if coordinated effectively. The opportunity lies in selective clustering rather than nationwide uniformity. States that align policy, infrastructure, and skills can move faster than others. This experimentation could produce multiple growth engines rather than a single hub. The risk is uneven success, creating perception gaps. Global firms compare performance across regions, not intentions. To replace China at scale, India must prove reliability cluster by cluster. Supply chains reward density and predictability more than ambition. India's outcome depends on whether it can accelerate ecosystem formation before global patience shifts again. The path is possible but narrow, requiring focused discipline and sustained coordination beyond announcements and incentives alone. Manufacturing power emerges from ecosystems, not factories built in isolation. Beyond factories and infrastructure, India's ability to become the next China depends heavily on institutional consistency over time. Manufacturing investment is long-term by nature, often spanning decades, and firms prioritize predictability above short-term incentives. China offered investors a clear expectation that policies would remain stable once commitments were made. In India, policy direction has improved, but perceptions of unpredictability still linger. Sudden regulatory changes, tax disputes, and retrospective interpretations in the past have shaped caution among investors. While reforms have reduced these risks, trust rebuilds slowly. Consistency across political cycles is especially important. Manufacturing hubs cannot be relocated easily once built. Firms need assurance that labor rules, trade policies, and taxation frameworks will not shift abruptly. India's democratic structure creates accountability but also introduces variability. Elections at state and national levels can alter priorities and timelines. This does not make democracy a disadvantage, but it does require stronger institutional buffers to protect long-term commitments. Judicial capacity also matters. Contract enforcement delays raise costs quietly and compound over time. China minimized this friction through administrative resolution mechanisms. India relies more heavily on courts, which are overburdened. Improvements are underway, yet scale remains an issue. Another factor is narrative management. China projected a single national growth story aligned across regions. India's narrative is more plural and fragmented. This diversity reflects reality but can dilute clarity for external investors. Aligning messaging with execution helps reduce uncertainty. India's strength lies in openness and rule of law, but these advantages must translate into speed and clarity. Without that, momentum slows. Institutions determine whether opportunity compounds or dissipates. India's test is whether reforms become habits rather than initiatives. When consistency replaces experimentation at scale, confidence deepens. Long-term capital flows only where rules feel boring and predictable. Another overlooked difference between India and China lies in how domestic demand interacts with manufacturing growth. China's rise was powered not only by exports, but by aggressive state-driven investment that absorbed output internally when global demand softened. India's growth model relies more heavily on private consumption and services, which changes the adjustment process during slowdowns. A large domestic market is an advantage, but it behaves differently from state-coordinated demand. Indian consumers are price-sensitive and fragmented across income levels, limiting the ability to absorb large volumes of manufactured goods during downturns. This places greater pressure on export competitiveness. If global demand weakens, factories must remain cost-efficient to survive without heavy state support. China could smooth cycles through directed credit and public investment at scale. India's fiscal space and institutional design limit such intervention. This constraint can be healthy, encouraging efficiency, but it also raises failure risk during shocks. Another factor is land and urban planning. Manufacturing thrives around dense urban centers that support labor mobility and supplier proximity. India's cities are expanding but often without coordinated industrial planning. Congestion housing shortages and infrastructure strain reduce productivity gains. China planned cities around industry. India is retrofitting industry into existing urban systems. This difference affects speed and scale. None of this negates India's potential, but it shapes trajectory. India's path will be slower, more uneven, and more market-driven. That can produce resilience, but also disappointment if expectations are misaligned. Becoming the next China does not mean replicating China's velocity. It means finding a different equilibrium that balances democracy markets and scale. The risk is comparison itself. Measuring success against China's timeline sets unrealistic benchmarks. India's success should be judged by sustainability, not speed. The outcome depends on whether patience holds long enough for compounding to take effect. Comparing paths without context creates pressure that can undermine progress. Whether India ultimately succeeds or fails as the next China depends on how expectations are managed as much as how reforms are executed. Comparisons create powerful narratives that attract capital, talent, and political momentum, but they also raise the cost of disappointment. China's rise was gradual in perception, even if rapid in reality. Expectations followed performance. In India's case, expectations are racing ahead of outcomes. This gap is risky because capital is patient only when confidence grows steadily. If early investments struggle, narratives can flip quickly from optimism to skepticism. That shift can slow inflows even when fundamentals remain intact. Managing this requires transparency rather than hype. Clear acknowledgement of constraints builds credibility. Overpromising creates fragility. India's advantage lies in its diversity. Multiple growth paths can coexist across states and sectors. Success does not require uniform transformation. However, global investors often seek simple stories. Next China is simple but misleading. India's strength is not replication, but differentiation. It can combine manufacturing growth with services, digital platforms, and domestic consumption in ways China did not. That hybrid model may be slower, but potentially more resilient. The risk is that chasing a single label distorts priorities. Policies designed to satisfy external comparisons may neglect internal needs. Sustainable growth requires aligning reforms with domestic realities rather than global narratives. India must define success on its own terms. If it does, progress compounds quietly. If it does not, volatility increases. The outcome is still open. Momentum exists, reforms are real, and opportunity is significant. But history shows that structural transformation rewards discipline more than ambition. India's future will be shaped not by whether it replaces China, but by whether it builds systems that deliver consistent results over time. Labels fade, performance endures. When stories move faster than systems, reality eventually pushes back. In the end, India becoming the next China is neither guaranteed nor impossible, but conditional on choices that are still unfolding. The global system clearly wants diversification, and India is the only country with the population scale, market size, and institutional base to even attempt this role. That alone explains the surge in attention. Yet replacing China was never just about labor or factories. It was about building a machine that aligned policy, infrastructure, finance, skills, and expectations over decades. India is building parts of that machine, but not all at the same speed. Some states are moving fast, others lag. Some sectors scale, others stall. This unevenness does not mean failure, but it does mean outcomes will be partial rather than absolute. India is more likely to become a complementary manufacturing power than a full substitute. That distinction matters. Complementarity can still generate growth, jobs, and influence, but it will not replicate China's dominance or timelines. The real risk lies in misreading this difference. If policymakers and investors expect a single China-sized outcome, disappointment becomes likely. If they accept a distributed, slower, more democratic model, progress looks more sustainable. India's strength is optionality. It can pivot between exports and domestic demand, manufacturing and services, global integration, and internal markets. That flexibility is an asset, not a weakness, but it requires patience. China's system compressed time at the cost of rigidity. India's system stretches time in exchange for adaptability. Which model performs better in a fragmented, uncertain world remains open. The answer will not arrive in headlines, but in steady execution over years. India does not need to become the new China to succeed. It needs to become a reliable version of itself. If systems keep improving and expectations stay grounded, the opportunity compounds. If narratives outrun delivery, momentum fades. The path is narrow but real, and its outcome will be decided by consistency rather than comparison. The future hinges less on imitation and more on whether patience outlasts pressure.